Our next speaker is Danny Haiphong. Danny is a socialist activist, writer, and political analyst. He is the host of The Left Lens. For the last 5 years, Danny has been a weekly contributor to Black Agenda Report. His articles also appear in publications such as MintPressNews, Counterpunch, the American Herald Tribune, Center for Global Research Canada, the Herald in Zimbabwe. Haiphong has frequently appeared on Black Agenda Radio, CPRNews with Don Debar, The Taylor Report, on RT, and on Sputnik International. So Danny, please go ahead.
Thanks, Radhika, for the introduction. Thanks to all the speakers thus far. Thanks to International Manifesto Group and all of the sponsors of this event. Today, I'm going to talk about, there's been a lot of really interesting points covered already. So I'm going to focus what my remarks on the ways in which the mainstream media, the Western mainstream media, attacks the threat of a good example. And in my opinion, I think that this isn't spoken about as much as it should be, because as KJ and Jing have already noted, the Western mainstream media is very committed to demonizing countries like China. And I want to focus attention on how the Western mainstream media has covered the aftermath, the fallout of the meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in Moscow, because I think this is a really good example of the function of the Western mainstream media. So in the days and weeks leading up to this event, we had the Western mainstream media continuously repeat the US government fabrication that China was going to supply weapons to Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. This was spoken about for weeks before the meeting took place on March 20th and ending on March 22nd. And it wasn't until the day afterward where the Biden administration actually admitted that no such thing had ever occurred, and it was not clear if it would ever occur. But the whole point of spreading this rumor in the Western mainstream media was the most culpable in spreading this rumor, because it offered no challenge to it, was to frame China as an arbiter of violence and one that is complicit in what is Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. And that is how all countries, including China, have been framed, for skirting and ultimately rejecting US and EU sanctions on Russia as part of the US and NATO's ultimate punishment that they've tried to level upon the Russian Federation. So the US government, the United States government, its intelligence officials, its spokespersons, its anonymous officials, these make up the primary sources of the Western mainstream media in its entirety whenever it comes to questions about China and Russia. And we also have to include the think tank regime that is massive and large, think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which are funded by the State Department, the Pentagon, and weapons contractors. So the Western mainstream media essentially is just a conduit of the United States' military regime, its military strategy. It is nothing more than a mouthpiece for the US war machine. And this includes all of the Western mainstream media at this point, because as we have seen through Russia's special military operation, through the conflict in Ukraine, there is not an independent bone in the European body at this point, whether it's politically or through its media. But in trying to attack the threat of a good example, which Russia and China's relationship ultimately represents, Russia and China are charting a course for a multipolar world. They are building an alternative to US unipolar hegemony. They are building an alternative to the US dollar and the hegemony of Western international finance and all of its austerity and debt-ridden chaos. They are building a new set of international relations that actually follows the UN Charter and respects the self-determination of nations around the world. This is a threat of a good example that China and Russia represent, in which the Western mainstream media need to so heavily demonize. But in many cases, actually, the Western mainstream media can't get around the fact that they are attacking the threat of a good example. And we can look at the case of China, given that the United States and its Western vassal states are so committed to containing, as KJ No said, and undermining China's rise. We even see today in the New York Times, all one has to do is search China in Google, read the Western mainstream media headlines, search in those articles for the actual content and read beyond the headlines. And you will see that even the Western mainstream media has incredible difficulty hiding the good example part of the threat that they so hysterically speak about. So in today's New York Times, there's actually an op-ed where the author talks about how China is putting off its Lehman moment, meaning that in a moment where you have Western financial institutions, you have Credit Suisse, for example, collapsing and being absorbed by UBS. You have Silicon Valley Bank in the United States and many others falling and collapsing. And you have really what has been an ongoing recession in the United States and the collective West. And this article by the New York Times essentially reveals that China is doing what the United States and what Western countries refuse to do with its financial sector, and that is to regulate it. And so in this article, the author talks about how creditor and investor rights and political risks of bailing out banks in the United States, for example, cannot really be achieved, meaning that there cannot be true regulation in the United States because there are investor and creditor rights that need to be respected. And the author admits that in China, financial institutions have to do what the government tells them, which is a demonizing way and an extremely negative way of saying that China actually regulates its financial institutions. And the article also admits that China not only regulates its institutions, but the majority, if not all, of its financial institutions are state-owned. And so what exactly is happening here? Well, the United States' primary source of mainstream media, the New York Times, is admitting that China actually regulates its financial institutions and that the United States and the collective West just can't do it. And that's why there's economic crises in the United States and the West, and that's why China is able to escape them. And of course, we see this all over in every single area. We see the Western mainstream media giving cover to the attacks on TikTok and the tech war on China because China has ascended technologically, and that cannot no longer be denied. They try to say that China is an imperialist in Africa, despite the fact that African countries welcome Chinese investment and have benefited mightily, not least in the damn near complete building of Africa's telecommunications sector and its electric grid through Chinese investment. They try to say that China's peace plan for Ukraine is not credible, despite the fact that Russia and even Ukraine had to admit its positive aspects. So we can see this over and over and over again, that the Western mainstream media parrots the line of the US military state, of the military industrial complex, of the Biden administration or whatever administration happens to be in office at any one time, that the foreign policy establishment dominates the Western mainstream media, and it at all costs attacks this good example, whether it's China, whether it's China-Russia relations, whether it is any development that comes out of the multipolar world that is emerging and that really has already ascended, and in which Xi and Putin's meeting this past week reflects. That is, I think, the biggest point I wanted to make, because the Western mainstream media has definitive interests. Its primary interest is to defend the rule of capital, particularly American capital, because that is what is hegemonic. Then its second purpose is to ensure that the political apparatus and the military apparatus, which defends those interests, is given carte blanche to do whatever it so chooses in order to solidify and reproduce those interests. So in that case, the Western mainstream media really has no other function than to serve as the information arm of the US ruling elite. And at this time, the political, economic, and military system of this elite, of the empire that it reigns over, is in precipitous decline, is in crisis. Whether we look at the financial crisis that is simmering and bubbling to 2008 levels, whether it is the COVID crisis, which, as you all know, China did incredibly well in containing and was demonized every step of the way for it, whether it is the rising costs of the US's military investments all around the world, not least $100+ billion for Ukraine. All of this has to be painted in a positive light. All of it has to be justified. And the most important function, I believe, for the Western mainstream media is to make it appear and look as if no other country has an alternative. No other people, no other nation has an alternative to this state of affairs. Thus, the Western mainstream media, while it does lie and distort reality and attempts to make really terrible things look good, it also has a huge and important task of ensuring that the reality of the situation, positive developments around the world, like what China is doing both domestically and internationally, like how Russia and China's relationship is charting a new path forward for the global South. All of these things have to be demonized. All of them have to be reined in and appear to look as if they are not legitimate and they are not worthy of any attention but negative attention. So I wanted to focus on that today. Thanks so much for the invitation, and I look forward to a good discussion.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.